give you just a very, very brief overview of where we're at with the violent video game research literature, and maybe from there kind of talk about what we can learn from that. So where we're at today is very different from where we were 20 years ago in terms of either the scholarly community or the public's view of violence in video games. So I think that's something interesting there. I think there's something illustrative about how narratives change over time and how data can help inform those narratives and what we can do to perhaps be a positive part of that change. So let me start by saying what I'm going to, again, very, very, very quickly go through are these just sort of general pools of data. And the main ones we have are empirical studies, like the kind that we do in psychology or communication research or other areas. Some psychiatrists and pediatricians get involved in this stuff too. So we'll look at the empirical studies. We'll also look at some data on mass homicide perpetrators. I'm going to try to be good and use the term mass homicide, not mass shooting. Those are two different things. They overlap somewhat, but they actually are two different phenomenon. It's easy to slip back and forth between them. I'm going to try to be good and not do that. So looking at data on mass homicide perpetrators like school shooters and other mass homicide perps. Also looking at U.S. epidemiological data on violent crime. So what has the U.S. looked like over time in terms of violent crime? And then also comparing us in the United States mostly versus other nations and seeing to what extent does video games explain or not explain violent crime rates across societies. So I think there's all kind of fun stuff to talk about. So again, this is going to be like the 50-cent overview of like 3 to 4 decades of research, hundreds of studies at this time, boiled down to one PowerPoint slide, which is somewhat presumptuous on my part. But this is kind of where things are at with the empirical studies. So there really are really two groups of studies that we as psychologists and communication researchers and game studies people do. One are experiments. And so the brief overview here is that with experiments, we tend to bring people into the lab, usually college students for pretty obvious reasons. They're just easy and free. Sometimes teenagers or other groups of people, but they're more expensive and less easy. And we randomize them to play one video game or another. One is violent, one is non-violent. Hopefully those games are matched on other qualities other than their violent content. Although, as you can imagine, that's actually quite hard to do. There's really no non-violent version of Grand Theft Auto out there. So it can be very difficult to find that match. And then we measure them on some form of aggression. Now, of course, in the lab, we can't have them beat each other up or knife each other. So we're really quite limited to what we could do with aggression. And so the typical aggression measure may be something like giving, the participant is able to give another person hot sauce in a sandwich when they think that person doesn't like spicy food. Okay, so just so we know what level of aggression we're talking about. We're talking like prank, April Fool's Day level of aggression. Now, these things are interesting. I'm not trying to throw the baby out with the bathwater here. I mean, I've used these measures myself. But they probably don't tell us too much about like what society really is concerned about. I mean, we're, the average person at home with, parent with kids wants to know, about like violent crime. They don't think like the gangs of Chicago are running around with wasabi sauce, trying to, make each other's mouths water or something like that. So they're interesting, but they're perhaps a bit distant from what we're actually, concerned about as a society. But the evidence here has been pretty mixed. There's a lot of debate about these. Some of that debate, I think, is sort of cooling off a little bit. I could be wrong, but I think it's cooling off a little bit. The evidence has been pretty mixed in that there are some studies that find evidence that violent video games may increase aggression. There are some studies that find no evidence that violent video games increase aggression. And there are some studies that find that violent video games may decrease aggression. That's probably the smallest of the three pools of evidence, but they are there. And like I said, there's probably a couple hundred studies at this point, many of which are very poor quality. That's the other thing to throw in there. We do have a much smaller pool of pre-registered studies, and some of you may know what that is, but if you don't, it's basically when we as scholars publish our hypotheses and methods and data analysis plan in advance of collecting any data, which makes it difficult for us to then massage our data to try to get the results we wanted to support our hypotheses. with this much smaller pool of preregistered studies. I think none have supported the idea that video game violence causes aggression. Almost all of them are null studies that have not found any effects. I think one out of maybe like 12 or 13 at this point, maybe a little bit, maybe more like 15 at this point, had mixed results, but most of them have been null, which I think from my mind is suggesting that's probably where things are at. That even though there certainly is some debate, that the best studies, the pre-registered studies at very least, are not finding evidence for effects, which suggests this was probably part of psychology's larger replication crisis for a while, particularly in the experimental studies. A lot of issues with publication bias and all that kind of stuff in the older studies. With longitudinal studies, this is where we're kind of like tracking kids over time. We can assess their video game violent playing habits at one time period, and of course their family environment, their mental health, their personality, and then track over time to see what predicts later violence. Generally speaking, I think these studies are clearer. We just don't see much evidence. The effect sizes are very, very small, near zero. In terms of linking violent video game playing at one time period with later, violent crime, bullying, who gets arrested, who gets diagnosed with conduct disorder, et cetera, et cetera. The bigger things tend to be if you start off at time one as aggressive, you tend to be aggressive at time two. And that doesn't matter if it's 1 year or 10 years. Some other mental health issues also seem to predict later violence, but it tends to be a fairly steady trait for most kids. So that's where we're kind of at with the empirical studies. Not a lot going on here that would suggest that this is something to worry about. The other pools of evidence are all correlational, so we just have to keep that in mind as we go through them here. The next one I want to talk about is just looking at the epidemiological data, looking at violent crime rates across time in the United States. And what we can see here is that the red line going down is the per capita youth violence victimization rate, as reported by the FBI. And as you can see, over time, the youth violence rate has gone down by over 80%. It's a pretty significant decline. Now, 2020 might be a weird year. I think some of the preliminary data is suggesting 2020 might be going up again quite a bit. But that was due to a lot of problems in 2020. But overall, crime is down, and that is good news. A lot of people don't know that. We're going to talk about like availability heuristics and sort of misimpressions. What's one misimpression is a lot of people think that crime is the worst it's ever been, and the evidence suggests quite the opposite. And by contrast, you can see the blue line going up, which is basically a quotient that is the amount in dollars spent on video games every year, adjusted for inflation, adjusted for per capita, and adjusted for the violent content of the top 5 video games each year. So it's a rough estimate of people's video game violence consumption. That has gone up over time. I don't think too many people dispute that. And what you have here is actually a fairly beautiful correlation. It's just in the wrong direction. If you were worried about violence in video games, it's actually like a negative 0.9 correlation. And so what you see is as we've consumed more violent video games, youth violence has declined. Now, again, this is correlational data, so we can't say this is causal. I don't necessarily think that it is causal, in fact. But if you are worried about this, if you are sort of like drawing a link, I mean, we know that correlation doesn't equal causation, but the complete absence, not only the complete absence of a correlation, but the correlation is in the complete opposite direction of what you were thinking you would see, should be a pretty big red flag that your theory is maybe in the wrong direction. Of course, violent crime is complicated. Lots of things contribute to it, but this is, I think, is pretty good evidence to suggest that we're in the wrong path here. And we can look at the cross-national data. Again, it's correlational. And what we're seeing here is that, basically this was data the Washington Post put together back in 2013. It hasn't really changed since then. Myself and a colleague are working on an update that's on revise and resubmit that basically found the same thing. And what you see is that there is, what's looking at this in this graph is gun violence or gun homicides. And what you see is that the correlation line is basically nothing, that the correlation between per capita video game consumption and gun violence is pretty much zero. In fact, the two, at least in this database, identified as the 2 countries with the highest per capita video game consumption, which were South Korea and the Netherlands, are 2 of the most peaceful countries in the plan. I think in our analysis, Japan ended up there with them, but other than that, there wasn't much difference. Now, fun fact. Now, what's embarrassing here, of course, is a little bit off the topic of video games, but what's embarrassing for the United States is, of course, we're all the way up here at the top, right, in terms of like homicide rates. Now, in fairness to the United States, if you were to change this graph, this is one of the things that we did. If you change this from gun homicides to assaults, the U.S. drops down into the middle of the pack. So we're not really that much different from a typical European country in terms of assault rates. So which kind of is interesting. It sort of speaks to, I think, to some extent, the impact of guns in terms of turning assaults into homicides, which may explain why our homicide rate is so much higher compared to other nations. But that's a whole other, controversial talk. What you do see is that the countries that end up at the top of the assault rate tend to be the Commonwealth countries. So the United Kingdom, New Zealand, Australia tend to have much higher assault rates than does the United States, as does France and Belgium, curiously enough. So I'm not sure exactly what's going on in those countries, but the good news for the United States that never really gets brought out is we're actually not a high assault country. We're actually a pretty average assault country, but we are a high homicide country. But that's really good data point for a gun violence debate, which we're not really having today. And then the last real data point is with mass homicide perpetrators themselves. And what we've known for like 20 years, really, this isn't new data. This has gone back to the United States Secret Service report from 2002. It's been updated a few times since, basically with the same finding, is that mass homicide perpetrators tend to consume on anything less violent media than do same-aged males. By comparison. So what they do is they actually do spend a lot of time with their own writing. So they write a lot about hate and violence and fantasies about killing people and stuff like that. And they may do things like internet searches for other mass homicide perpetrators. Not all of them even do that necessarily, but they don't necessarily play a lot of violent video games, watch a lot of violent movies or television, which is kind of interesting. And what then happens is two things that happen really kind of in news media. This is going to kind of lead us into our conversation about the sort of availability cascades and misimpressions about stuff in general. And one, of course, is confirmation bias. And of course, those of you in psychology, you're probably very familiar with this concept, but it's something we all do. And that is we tend to look for information to support our pre-existing beliefs and not report or not take an interest or perhaps even be hostile towards information that would conflict with our pre-existing beliefs. Unfortunately, news media do this too. And which probably, again, isn't a stunning surprise to most of you. But for example, with the mass homicides, sometimes you hear if a young male commits a mass homicide, everybody starts talking about video games. When an older male, or more rarely a female, commits a mass homicide, nobody talks about video games. The issue of video games is ignored. And that creates the availability in the general public to perceive a correlation where one does not exist, because just nobody talks about video games when a case is. So for instance, I mentioned the Las Vegas shooter. It was October of, I always forget if it's 2017, 2018. For some reason I always remember the month, not the year. And he basically smashed out a window in his hotel. It was a 64-year-old male and opened fire on a country music festival outside of his hotel. And at this point, I believe he has the record for deaths due to a mass homicide in the United States. And in that case, nobody talked about video games at all. There was no interest in the video game, so nobody exonerates video games in these situations. Say, well, it's an old guy, he didn't play video games, so maybe we should think about something else as the cause of these types of events. And the other thing you tend to find is this, as I call it, the follow-through failure effect. Well, I didn't invent that. Other people call it this too. Which basically means that news media will hype something for a while, and when it turns out they're wrong, they don't tell people that they were wrong. So people are left with that misimpression. So a classic example of mass homicides here is the Sandy Hook shooting in 2012. A 20-year-old male went into an elementary school, killed 20 children and 6 faculty and staff members. He also had killed his mother, and then he committed suicide. Because he was a 20-year-old male, people talked about violence in video games for about 11 months. It was an 11-month investigation. The investigation itself was silent. They didn't say anything about what they were looking at. But in the news media, there are all these reports of a source close to the investigation anonymously reporting that they're really looking at Call of Duty, or something of that sort. And it turned out after 11 months, they finally released the investigation report. And I don't know if anybody remembers, but the game that they found that he played the most was Dance Dance Revolution, which is just what it sounds like on the tin. It's a dancing game. It's no violence in it. whatsoever. Now, you know, as any young male, he probably had played both some violent and non-violent games in the past, but he had no particular obsession with violence in video games. He mostly played non-violent games, at least in the years leading up to the shooting. And even in a month later, the investigators did what we call a document dump. They basically released all of their records onto the internet. It was like tens of thousands of pages. It was all the individual police officers' reports and all that kind of stuff. And I just did a search through it, you know, a keyword search for video games. And the only things I could find in there, it wasn't much on video games at all. And the only things I could find that when police officers talked about video games, it was when they would talk to some of the families of the victims, and the families would ask them, you know, so what's going on with the video game stuff that we keep hearing about in the news media? And the officers would tell them, like, it's a hoax theory. We're not interested in video games. You know, we don't see any evidence that that's a cause. So what the news media were saying and what the investigation was actually doing, I don't know who those anonymous sources were very different things. But unfortunately, an investigation report got barely any coverage in the news media. So they just kind of let it hang. They never said, hey, look, you know, for 11 months we were talking about video games. It turns out he played mostly Dance Dance Revolution. So I guess we were wrong about that. They just kind of let it hang out there. And so you still find people talk about like Sandy Hook as if that was a link with violence in video games when it was not in that situation. So it brings us to this concept of availability cascades. So this is first place I came across this. I was actually in an article by Blackwell and Quillette. It's a very good article if you have a chance to look it up. It kind of raises this idea of availability cascades. That wording combination itself doesn't really appear a lot in the psychological literature. I did look it up. There are a few articles that bring it up, but it seems to be somewhat of a new concept. And the idea of the availability cascade, and we can kind of see how it happened with video games, is it has a bunch of different elements to it. So it's, of course, has a similarity to the much better known concept of the availability heuristic. So with the availability heuristic, if you can easily recall an event, you will tend to exaggerate the frequency with which that event happens. So the classic example of an availability heuristic is airplane crashes, right? So people tend to be much more afraid of airplane crashes than car crashes because airplane crashes tend to get tons of news media attention. There just was one a few weeks ago. It wasn't even a crash. It was just the United Airlines engine where the engine blew up, right? And the pieces of it landed in someone's pickup truck. Nobody died, fortunately, in that situation. But events like that, you know, people can recall them very easily. So I can remember the last time I heard about an airplane crash. I can't remember the last time I heard about a car crash. And so in that situation, people will tend to exaggerate or overestimate the frequency of that sort of event. Even though at this point, I think most people probably know that car crashes are actually much deadlier than airplane crashes, as are ferries for some reason. Apparently ferries are deadly, but airplanes are about the safest way to travel. Typically with availability cascades, the issue is a dramatic one. It's going to get a lot of attention in news media, and the average individual has limited information about it. So the typical person has no basis in fact to know about that thing. They don't have data. They may have lived experiences, but that's not data, right? Yeah, so they don't know the numbers, they don't know the research, they don't know the information. All they know is what they hear in news media, and with no other source of information, they're just sort of lost and are dependent upon news media telling the truth, which unfortunately news media don't always do. And that's true for most of us on most issues, right? So if you ask me about global warming, I don't know anything about global warming. Where do I get most of my information about global warming is news media, right? You know, so I believe that global warming is real. I believe it's dangerous. It makes sense to me, but I don't know anything about it, and so I have to, you know, buy the idea that news media is being somewhat responsible in its, and I hope that it is, you know, in its portrayal of you know, of these things. Which brings again to the next point, is that news media tends not to tell the truth. I don't know that they're deliberately lying exactly, but they, you know, they need clicks, they need subscribers, so they tend to hype things that are interesting, and that creates certain types of biases. So here again, we see the selective reporting and confirmation bias. I remember the case of a few years ago. I was talking to some news reporters in St. Louis, and they were all upset about this thing. It was called the knockout game. And what they were doing is not the idea of the knockout game is that you have a young person, usually a young male, who thinks that they're playing a game. If they can knock out someone with one punch, then they're going to, like, you know, get points. Everything's about getting points in these things. Get points, and they're going to, like, advance in the game or whatever. It's totally a moral panic. It's not a true thing. But these reporters would report like, a young male attacks a stranger, as sometimes happens, and then later another young male attacks a stranger. And so I get these calls saying, we're going through an epidemic of knockout king assaults. I said, okay, well, that's interesting. So how many have you had? Well, we had, one last year. Okay. And when was the next one? Well, it's been a year, and we had another one yesterday. So 2 in 1 year. That's what you've had. That doesn't make a trend. That's not an epidemic. So eventually you can kind of talk to reporters sometimes through this stuff and say, well, now you're just looking for cases to fit the narrative. You're kind of digging around, and that itself is kind of biasing. It's going to give people a misimpression about what's going on. So you did have these like new reporters, politicians, all upset about this knockout king thing based on, I think it was 2 or 3 anecdotal cases spread out over a year to a year and a half. But they thought it was happening like every day. If you asked a general person on the street, they would have said, yeah, it seems like every day we're having one of these things, but that wasn't in fact, accurate. And same thing with the follow-through failure effect. People don't ever hear the follow-up, then they think that the previous reporting is still true, even when the reporters themselves may now know that it isn't. With an availability cascade, it also tends to take on this sort of moral component to it, right? With video games, for instance, it was all about saving the children. The video games harms children. It's just like rewiring their brains, all that kind of language and such. And what then happens is if you are trying to fact check, if you're trying to be more skeptical, very quickly you'll start hearing that you don't love children. And I've heard that. I don't get that much anymore, but certainly back in like the early 2000s and stuff, you must, really not care. You're hurting children with your research was a thing that I did hear at times in the early years. Don't really hear it anymore. Nobody thinks that, or very few people think that anymore. But at the beginning of my career, I was very, very common sort of comment. Obviously, that disincentivizes a lot of people. A lot of people don't want to hear that, right? So that you have to be okay with people disliking you in order to continue with that. So that creates a kind of bias. And of course, there are social pressures to conform and not do any, fact checking. You're a bad person, and you may lose your job if you don't support the narrative. I used to get, and I don't get it as much anymore, but I still get it occasionally. Where people assume that if my research doesn't find that video games cause aggression, I must be funded by the video game industry, which I'm not. So that people sort of leap to a bad faith interpretation of why you're doing what you're doing or whatever else. And again, so it's just easy for most people. They don't want to get involved. They don't want to be in the middle of that, because they don't want to get called, I don't know, any of the ists or phobes at this point, right? You don't be called a bad person because your data didn't happen to support whatever narrative is sort of, desirable, at the moment. And we kind of see how this is, happen with other events. And I try to be kind of fair with these and not like all pick on the right or the left, and such. And some of these are pretty nuanced. You can kind of even say like, maybe both sides have their own narratives that they're pretty attached to. But going back in the 80s, there was a satanic ritual abuse panic, the idea that Satanists were kidnapping children and sexually assaulting them or even killing them, sacrificing them to Satan. This was supported by news media, it was supported by politicians, it was supported by clinicians, some clinicians at the time. So everybody kind of jumped on board with it. Actually get kind of revived, not the satanic part, but the sort of repressed memory stuff. There was an article in one of the, I forget if it was Atlantic or New York Magazine or one of those, sort of trying to revive repressed memories, at least just recently. And it caused harm. People went to jail for crimes they didn't commit. People were incarcerated for years in some cases without being convicted because they weren't able to afford the bail money for allegedly assaulting children or killing them when there was no evidence, in fact, that they had done so. 9/11, of course, we saw this massive groupthink after 9/11. Nobody questioned the government, nobody questioned the president. And you can see with some of these things, I mean, the crisis is real. I mean, child abuse is bad. That happens. We should be worried about it. 9/11 was bad. We get attacked. We should worry about it. But what then happens is that fear and anxiety sort of create a pressure to conform with the group narrative. And in that case, it led us to the Patriot Act, which we're still dealing with in some versions of it, today, which decreased our protections from decreased due process from the federal government and from the police. and led us into these sort of never-ending wars in the Middle East. I'm not saying we shouldn't have done anything, but yeah, I think most of us would agree that particularly the war in Iraq was, had nothing to do with the 9/11 attack, and caused us a lot of. It was expensive. A lot of people died. It caused us a reputational problem and such. COVID-19 is maybe more like both sides have really kind of polarized this to some extent. I mean, again, the crisis is real. We should have the best data, knowing what to do, right? We should probably wear masks. My understanding is that's where the data is. We should probably get the vaccine. It seems like the best data we have now suggests that they're effective and safe. On the other hand, I remember last summer, so I'm kind of picking on the mask or tyranny crowd a little bit. On the other hand, I remember all the people were complaining that people in Florida were going to the beach, and such. And it turns out, as long as you avoid like massive crowds at the beach is pretty safe to go to. So I mean, there's a little bit of both sides, sort of like digging in their moral heels and throwing snowballs at the other side, rather than kind of trying to sift through the data. And and granted, our leadership was pretty terrible, so we probably needed someone to have some leadership, and we didn't get that, unfortunately, in the situation. And of course, more recently, which I think is on a lot of people's minds right now, is the race and policing controversies. Again, there are real issues, and I support, certain types of criminal justice reform. And on the other hand, I'm not always sure that everybody's getting the best information, and there may actually, if anything, be disincentives to provide students or the general public with the actual data on some of the stuff if it doesn't necessarily support, particularly the Black Lives Matter organization narrative and such. So this concept of availability heuristics overlaps quite a bit with moral panics. So there is a sociological theory called moral panic theory that goes back all the way back to the 70s. If you're really going to pin me down, what's the difference between an availability heuristic and a moral panic? There's a pretty big overlap, between the two. I mean, really the big difference is the availability heuristic concept is much more cognitive than social. So it kind of, with the availability heuristic, is kind of explaining the cognitive mechanisms by which people develop false beliefs and maintain them and are pressured into maintaining them. And it tends to have a wider focus. So moral panics tend to focus in on either tech or media issues or things involving kids. So you see a lot of stuff about juveniles being the worst they've ever been. Of course, whatever the latest technology being terrible, 5G, is going to cause cancer, whatever I don't know. It's hard to keep track of some of these things. Whereas availability heuristics can be on a much wider range of things. So environmental issues, the world's going to end in 10 years, that kind of narrative about global warming. Again, I think global warming is real. Don't get me wrong. I think some of the hysteria perhaps a little bit overblown. Disease issues, political issues. Just over the weekend, the CPAC, I don't know if any of you are following the conservative, well, I don't even know what they are exactly, but CPAC had their thing, and they're all over the media was like, are they having hidden Nazi symbols everywhere? And, we can say that the modern GOP is bad without saying they're Nazis, and there's a certain amount of ridiculous to always looking for Nazi symbols everywhere in the Republican Party. But those are all, kind of, people just kind of looking for this information to support their narratives, and it's got that sort of moral pressure behind it. Again, be very clear, it doesn't mean that the issue isn't real. It just means that the way people are dealing with it becomes unhinged from data, unhinged from facts, much more moral, and is putting pressure on people to conform and the sort of like groupthink, sort of mentality. So what can you do, with availability cascades? So having kind of been through one, over the last 15 to 20 years, what is it like, and how do you get from the place where people in 2005 are comparing video games to smoking and lung cancer to 2021, where most people think that's ridiculous to say any such thing? One is availability cascades tend to overreach into absurdity pretty quickly. Video games are like smoking and lung cancer. There are hidden Nazi symbols all over the GOP. Come on. I mean, I think the GOP's got issues. Don't get me wrong. Are they the Nazis? No, I don't think they're the Nazis. Do Nazis prefer them over Democrats? Yes, but they're, I don't think the Nazi wing is necessarily that large. So by doing so, they tend to provoke backlashes over time. Maybe backlash is kind of a harsh word. It's got a little bit of a bite to it, but cancel culture is a classic example of this, right? Once it started getting into trying to lose people's jobs, Then the narrative switches again, and people start wondering, like, I think this is, the average person begins to think this is kind of getting unhinged. And they may just need a little bit of help in terms of understanding what the data is to solidify that, that little kernel of doubt, what might be going on. There is this perception that in the initial months or years that an availability cascade can be, and this is a quote from Jonathan Haidt, by the way, when we were talking about some things a few months back. So it's his words. Runaway train is how he described it. So getting right in front of one, you'll get run over. So you do need to have a little bit of patience with some of these things and approach them strategically. And this is something I've been thinking about with particularly the race and policing issue, which I have some involvement with as well, not as much as with video games. But even last week, I teach forensic psychology, so we talked about race and policing last week, and I certainly for months was thinking about, like, okay, how do I deal with this? Given everything that happened in the previous summer, so you do need to be strategic, be patient, don't leap right in front of it when everybody's super emotional, because that just won't be the best time to do that. Focus on data. You're going to find that people don't like data, but keep trying. And over time, people will listen to the data. You have to kind of present it, in a way that the average person can digest, but keep focusing on data, and people will eventually come around. It's going to take them years. They will eventually come around to that data. Remain civil. This is if I had put a highlight on any of these, and all of your discussions about these things, remain civil, even if you're not getting that back. I have gotten unhinged people talking to me, and you just learn. That's the next point: is learn how to disengage when an argument is becoming too heated and people are starting to get ad hominem, or just back out of it. You're not going to gain anything at that point. As the saying goes, don't get into a mud fight with a pig. Only nobody comes out looking clean, and only the pig has fun, as the old cliche, goes. So stay civil. Don't tell jokes. I joke about everything. I have a very sarcastic, dark sense of humor. If it's something that is, in the mid, everybody's worried about it, don't tell jokes about it. It's not the time. Be strategic about this stuff. Tell jokes about something else, but not about that thing. Maybe in 20 years you can tell jokes about it, but not right away. Repetition and patience. Patience. You're not going to get good feedback right off the bat. People are upset, people are emotional, they're not going to listen. You may convince them, but it may take them months or years before they really remember what you said, and so you may have an impact and not know it. We like instantaneous feedback, and a lot of these things we're not going to get it. So like I said, I've been at this for 20 years, and then probably it's been the last 5. I said, I think things would come around. So it is a patience game. And that brings me to my last point there is optimistic estimate, 10-year cycle for an availability cascade. So people are going to jump on board, and certain people are going to have sunk costs on that issue, because they're going to go all the way down a limb. And smoking and lung cancer, video games are like that. It's hard to back away from that claim. And so it's going to take patience. But if you keep at it, you keep bringing good data to the table, you remain civil, be the best person in the room, you'll get there. The things will change. Nothing ever stays the same, and you can convince people. You can even convince the general public if you keep at it over time. And I think this is kind of how to do it. So anyway, so that is my spiel. If you want to contact me, here's my information, my email at Stetson University, which is down here just outside of Orlando. You want to follow me on Twitter? That's my Twitter handle. Twitter is the worst place to have any kind of civil debate on anything, but you can try. I have a website. You can check out all my research publications are there, and I also publish a little bit of fiction. Some of that's available for free, so you can check that out. I have no conflicts of interest to declare. Again, I don't work for the video game industry. But if you want to support my kids' college fund, you can buy my book if you want to with Patrick Markey. It's available through Amazon and Barnes & Noble. If you want a signed copy, you can shoot me an email. We could work out a deal for a signed copy. But that's my spiel for today. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. So if you guys have questions, I'm happy to answer any questions you guys might have about